Let's continue with other terminologies. Let's speak about assets. What is the scope of security? What are we trying to protect? It's going to be assets, which is anything of value to an organization. That means it can be a computer, it can be a specific portion of a computer, it can be a network device, it can be a specific text file, it can be a PDF file, it can be what else? A physical, so it can be any physical. The asset can have any kind of a physical aspect or any kind of electronical aspects. It all depends. It's something which the organization owns and it has a value to the organization, and then we're gonna see that in the end, the organization has to protect and is gonna protect which assets, because not all assets are equally the same. Not all assets are equally the same from the value point of view, which means not all of them should be protected with the same in the same way at the same, let's say, level. And each asset is going to be vulnerable to different kind of attacks or different kind of exploits. So in order to provide the appropriate level of security to an asset that the enterprise, the organization owns, which means by providing the security level, a specific security level to an asset, we're actually lowering the risk level. So if the risk level can be 0 to 100%, then by implementing specific security technologies to guard or defend or to protect specific assets, then the risk level is going to remain to be 10%. So the risk level remains to be 10% or 20% or 30%, for example. And now, in order to be able to provide the appropriate level, as I was saying, we have to identify the assets or classify them. And now the assets are classified into categories by each organization individually. There is not let's say a common standard for classifying assets. It is known to, like, for example, common private organizations to classify their assets into specific categories, like into public, sensitive, private, and confidential. Where, for example, if you take, let's say, organization, an asset which is classified as public, which means it's like a publicly available resource. Like, for example, take a company and their website. Data which resides on their website, most of it is going to be identified or classified as being public, because it is publicly available, which means that it doesn't matter who gains access to the data on that web server. It is actually meant to be reachable and available to every user who actually is gonna in the end access that data in there. Then we have sensitive data. Like, for example, sensitive data, if you have in that web portal, let's say in that on that web server, you offer both authenticated and unauthenticated pages. For example, so for the users to get access to specific data on that web server, they, let's say, have to be authenticated. Like, for example, let's take Gmail or Yahoo Mail or any kind of webmail. You use a browser, you open up, you put in the URL to access Gmail or Yahoo Mail or any kind of webmail, and then you authenticate with your username and password. Then, for example, in that case, whatever is accessed, so that whatever the content, the inbox and the outbox, the content of your mailbox, that could be considered sensitive. So it's not public. The service is public, the Gmail service is public, the webmail service is public, is reachable to everybody, but then based on each user's credentials, each user gets access to its own to its own data, to its own mailbox. So that could be considered to be sensitive, for example. Then we have, that's going to be so the publicly available data, but it can be considered to be public, which is unauthenticated access from anybody on the internet, or sensitive, which means it requires some kind of authentication, and then each user gets access to its own data. Then we can have something which is called private. So private means that's going to be like, for example, if we took Google with their web services, that's going to be like resources which reside on privately available web servers. So for example, data on web servers which are not reachable from the internet, they are reachable only from the inside of the network. It means that can be classified, for example, as private data. So it should not be available to the public by any means. It's reserved only for internal use for employees. Like that could be, as I was saying, whatever is available on an internal web server. For example, company security procedures and policies. That's not something to be publicly available, either to be classified as public or as sensitive. It is a private classification of data. And then can be confidential, which confidential could be, if we took Google as an example, could be something which is clearly private, but also being confidential, it means that it has to be available only to very specific users and only in very specific environments. Like for example, let's speak about the financial reports, the annual financial reports, not those ones because those are publicly available. Let's speak about, for example, the employee salaries. That's confidential data. So that is, first of all, private, but private means it's accessible by a lot of users. It's a special type of private data, private asset, which means it is going to be restricted to be accessed only by specific users and only in specific conditions. Like as I was saying, the salaries the employee salaries are only known, are only, let's say, published in a specific system, which only the financial department can access, and only certain people can access that in there and actually visualize back and forth the salaries. So that could be classified as confidential, and because it's confidential, maybe that system also offers some kind of added security, like data in transit is going to be encrypted, authenticated, protected for integrity, and all of those use cases. Likewise, if we take a common public organization, in general, they could classify their assets into what is called unclassified, which is close to what meant public on the private organization. So it's data that basically they really don't care to call it that way. It's whatever, it's public, but they don't even put in the resources to classify it and see if there's any value to the data. It's unclassified. It can be confidential data, and then secret, and then top secret. So for example, on public organizations like governments, what is called top secret, a lot of times it's not even available in electronic format. So what is called top secret, either it's an information which is only spoken but never written, for example, or it's information which it is written but on a physical piece of paper. It's like a document, but it's not available electronically, for example. Because to steal a physical document, you need 100% physical access to the location that document is stored. So you need physical access, and you need the tools, or you need the tools available to open up the lockers that guard that data from being accessible. It's going to be like within a container or a safe, which is of course guarded by a lot of security measures like surveillance cameras, PIN code, maybe different keys, multiple keys to be used at the same time. Like for example, to open up the door or a top secret document is being stored, multiple users have to show up at the same time with their own keys and use the keys at the same time, for example. Like that's how nuclear launch bombing works. There's no way you're going to allow one individual to be able to use its key, its security tool, and activate launching a atomic bomb against whatever other country, right? So it has to be multiple people that they have to agree, yes, you're going to do this, and then they're going to use their keys to actually validate and instruct the system to launch the atomic bomb, for example. So that's going to be top secret. While secret is going to be something which could optionally be available in the electronic format, but because it's classified as secret, it has to be very strictly guarded by a lot of security measures to make sure it's not being leaked out. Of course, there are other organizations that can choose their own classification, let's say categories. They can either make use of this commonly well-known ones, or they can come in there and make up their own categories to define assets, and then based on the category of the asset, they're going to end up having a certain value. Because the classification of assets not only tells based on the classification of an asset is going to end up being accessible to certain users in certain, like the whole internet, or only employees, or only certain employees, is going to end up being accessible in certain ways, like unauthenticated, like public web services, or authenticated, like private web services. And then the transmission can be encrypted, authenticated. It can provide also integrity. So based on the classification of the data, the more, let's say, valuable the data is, the more and stricter security measures and controls are going to be implemented, and the more stricter and more advanced technologies, it means more costs are going to be involved to deploy those technologies to safeguard the data. And it makes sense, like the more valuable the data is, you can actually end up investing more money to guard a highly sensitive data in there. Like from the government point of view, there are some data which are classified as top secret, which are kind of like their value. It has to do, their value is gonna decrease over years. Like for example, if a government has decided to take a specific action against specific organizations, and they classify that action as top secret with the plan of acting, then that's going to be classified as top secret, for example, for 50 years or 100 years or 30 years, which means nobody who was involved in that act, and they are aware of what happened, nobody is allowed to speak about it or say anything about what happened in there. And likewise, that act is like the act which was signed is going to be safeguarded, so that nobody can open it up for those 30 or 50 years. It's there to be accessible only after the asset has lost its value. So it's different categories of classifications of data, and I gave this example to also show you that a specific asset can be classified in a specific category, but it can stay in that category for a specific amount of time. Afterwards, it can actually lose all of its value, or it can become less valuable. Like as I was saying, a top secret data can be top secret for 50 years, and then can be publicly available. It's going to change its category at that point. As I was saying, criteria for asset classification varies a lot, like liability, or replacement costs, or as I was saying, age of the asset, or the value of the asset, and all of those can change, especially as time goes. So there are some assets that their values changes over time, or there are some assets that their values remains the same across the entire, let's say, lifetime of an organization. Like for example, as I was saying, like the employee salaries. So the employee status will be classified as confidential as long as a specific organization exists, because they're going to always have employees, and that's confidential data. And because employees come and go, it's still employees. So that asset is going to be classified as confidential at all times. Its value and its classification doesn't change across as time goes.